Hi there, boys and girls. Time for story time with Mr. Riddle. Now, supper time here at the Riddle House. But if you haven't eaten supper yet, you might want to try some Scrambled Eggs Super by Dr. Seuss. Now, this is a little bit of a long story, but it's one that you might not have heard before. This is one I found in the library. Thanks, Mrs. McReynolds. You ready? I don't like to brag, and I don't like to boast, said Peter T. Hooper. But speaking of toast, and speaking of kitchens and ketchup and cake and kettles and stoves and the stuff people bake, well, I don't like to brag, but I'm telling you, Liz, that speaking of cooks, I'm the best that there is. Why, only last Tuesday, when Mother was out, I really cooked something worth talking about. He's telling his friend about something he fixed in the kitchen. You see, I was sitting here, resting my legs, and I happened to pick up a couple of eggs. And I sort of got thinking, it's sort of a shame that scrambled egg always tasted the same. And that's because ever since goodness knows when, they've always been made from the eggs of a hen. Just a plain common hen. What a dumb thing to use, with all of the other fine eggs you could choose. And so I decided that just for a change, I'd scramble a new kind of egg on the range. Some fine fancy eggs that no other cook cooks, like the eggs of the ruffle-necked salamagooks. A salamagooks say they should be good. So I went out and found some as quick as I could. And while I was lugging them back to my house, I happened to notice a tizzle-topped grouse in a tree down the street. And I knew from her looks that her egg and the egg of the salamagooks ought to mix mighty well, ought to taste simply super when scrambled together by Peter T. Hooper. That's the boy's name. Peter T. Hooper. So I took those eggs home and I frizzled them up, and I added some sugar, 2/3 of a cup, and a small pinch of pepper, and also a pound of horseradish sauce that was sitting around, and also some nuts. Then I tasted the stuff, and it tasted quite fine, but not quite fine enough. To make the best scramble that's ever been made, a cook has to hook the best eggs ever laid. So I drove to the country, quite rather far out, and I studied the birds that were flitting about. I looked with great care at the mop-noodled finch, and I looked at the beagle-beaked, bald-headed grinch, and also I looked at a shade-roosting quail, who was roosting right under a lassalax tail, and I looked at a spritz and a flannel-winged jay, but I didn't just stop. I kept right on my way, because they didn't have eggs. They weren't laying that day. Then suddenly, boy, up that hill a short space, birds, they were laying all over the place. Great happy gay families with uncles and cousins, all laying fine strictly fresh eggs by the dozens. Why, I'd have a scramble more super than super. Scrambled eggs super-de-duper-de-booper, special deluxe a la Peter T. Hooper. I picked out the eggs in a most careful way. I only picked those I knew were grade A. I only took eggs from the very best fowls. So I didn't take eggs from the twiddler owls, because I knew that the eggs of those fellows who twiddle taste sort of like dust from inside a bass fiddle. twiddling their thumbs. Twiddle owls. I went for the kind that were mellow and sweet, and the world's sweetest eggs are the eggs of the queet, which is due to those very sweet trout which they eat. And those trout, well, they're sweet because they only eat wogs, and wogs, after all, are sweetest of frogs, and the reason they're sweet is whenever they lunch, it's always the world's sweetest bees that they munch. And the reason no bees can be sweeter than these, they only eat blossoms of bezelnut trees. And those bezelnut blossoms are sweeter than sweet, and that's why I nabbed several eggs from the queet. Queet eats the trout eats the wog eats the bees, who gets the nectar from the bezelnut trees. That's why they're so sweet. But I passed up the eggs of a bird called a strudel, who's sort of a stork, but with fur like a poodle. For they say these eggs are of this kind of stork are gluey like glue, and they stick to your fork. And the yolks of those eggs, I am told, taste like fleece, while the whites taste like very old bicycle grease. You think the strudel looks like he has fur from a poodle? The places I hiked to, the roads that I rambled, to find the best eggs that have ever been scrambled. I hunted new birds along wild tangled trails, through gullies and gulches, down dingles and dales. I wriggled my way and I crawled at a creep through a forest of ferns that was 40 miles deep. And I mushed through the brush till I found a fine quigger whose eggs were as big as a pinhead, no bigger. Then I went for the eggs of a long-legger quong. Now this quong, well, she's built just a little bit wrong, for her legs are so terribly, terribly long that she has to lay eggs 20 feet in the air, and they drop with a plop to the ground from up there. So unless you can catch them before the eggs crash, you haven't got eggs, you've got long-legger hash. To catch the eggs before they hit the ground, or they're going to be broken open. You won't like that. Eggs. I'd collected 302, but I still needed more, and I suddenly knew that the job was too big for one fellow to do. So I telegraphed north to some friends near Frazol, which is about 10 miles or so beyond the North Pole. And they, all of them, jumped in their kamikaze, which is sort of a boat made of a sea leopard's hide, which they sailed out to sea to go looking for grice, which is a sort of bird which lays eggs on the ice, which they grabbed with a tool which is known as a squitch, because those eggs are too cold to be touched without which. And while they were sending those eggs, I got word of a bird that does something that's almost unheard of. It's hard to believe, but this bird is called a pelf. She lays eggs that are 3 times as big as herself. How that pelf ever learned such a trick, I never found out. But I found that egg quick, and I managed to get it down off the nest and home to the kitchen along with the rest. Eggs that are 3 times as big. It's a pretty big egg for a bird. But I didn't stop then, 'cause I knew of some ducks by the name of the single file Zoomazoo zucks, who stroll single file through the mountains of Zooms, quite oddly enough, with their eggs on their thumbs. And some fellows in Zoom, who I happen to know, just happened to capture 1,000 or so, and they wrapped up their eggs, and they mailed them by air, marked special delivery, handle with care. They all march in single file, in a straight line. I needed more helpers, and so for assistance, I called up a fellow named Ali, long distance, and Ali, as soon as he hung up the phone, picked up a small basket and started alone to climb the steep crags and jags of Mount Struku to fetch me the egg of the Mount Struku cuckoo. Now these Mount Struku cuckoos are rather small gals. But these Mount Struku cuckoos have lots of big pals. They dive from the skies with wild cracking shrieks, and they jabbed at his legs, and they stabbed at his cheeks with a yammering, clamoring, hammering beaks. But brave Ali, he fought his way through, and he sent me that egg as I knew he would do, for my scrambled eggs super-de-duper-de-booper, special deluxe, a la Peter T. Hooper. Bird has lots of friends, and they're all chasing him because he took the egg. In the meanwhile, of course, I was keeping real busy collecting the eggs of the 3-eyelash tizzy. They're quite hard to reach, so I rode on the top of a hamika, shimnika, snanika, schnap. Then I found a great flock of southwest-facing cranes, and I guess they've got something that's wrong with their brains. For this kind of crane, when she's guarding her nest, will always stand facing precisely southwest. So to get at those eggs wasn't hard in the least. I came up from behind, from precisely northeast. And I captured the egg of the grickly gractus, who lays them high up in a prickly cactus. And then I went for some ziffs. They're exactly like zuffs, but ziffs live on cliffs, and the zuffs live on bluffs. And seeing how bluffs are exactly like cliffs, it's mighty hard telling the zuffs from the ziffs, but I know that the egg that I got from the bluffs, if it wasn't a ziffs from the cliffs, it was a zuffs. Now, I needed the egg of a moth-watching sniff, who's a bird who's so big she scares people to death. And this awful big bird, well, the reason they name her the moth-watching sniff is because that's how they tame her. She likes watching moths. Sort of quiets her mind. And while she is watching, you sneak up behind and you yank out her egg. So I got one, of course, with the help of some friends and a very fast horse. I'm gonna yank out that egg with a really fast horse and get out of there. Because she's really, really big. If you want to get eggs that you can't buy at a store, why, you'll have to do things that you've never thought of before. Why, to get the egg of a very small dwarf, we have to pry all the mountaintop off. Off. Get that little egg inside there. heard of some birds who lay eggs, if you please. They taste like air in the holes of the Swiss cheese. And they live in a big Zanzibar tree. Live in the Zanzibar trees. So I ordered a tree full. The job was immense, but I needed those eggs and said, hang the expense. So we ordered the whole tree so we get a whole bunch of those eggs. Look, you see the birds way up here. It would be awfully expensive to order a whole tree. I still needed one more, and I saved it for last. The egg of the frightful, bombastic aghast. And that bird is so mean, and that bird is so fast, that I had to escape on a Jalika jast. A fleet-footed beast who can run like a deer, but looks sort of different. You steer him by ear. All through with the searching, all through with the looking, and I had all I needed, and now for the cooking. I rushed to the kitchen, the place where I'd stacked 'em. I rolled up my sleeves, I unpacked 'em and cracked 'em, and shucked 'em and chucked 'em in 99 pans. Then I mixed in some beans. I used 55 cans. Then I mixed in some ginger, 9 prunes, and 3 figs, and parsley, quite sparsely, just 22 sprigs. Then I added 6 cinnamon sticks and a clove, and my scramble was ready to go on the stove. Look at all of those eggs. And you know how they tasted? They tasted just like, well, they tasted exactly just like scrambled eggs, super-de-duper be booper, special deluxe, a la Peter T. Hooper. The end of Scrambled Eggs Super by Dr. Seuss. So if you haven't fixed anything for supper yet, maybe ask Mom and Dad to fix scrambled eggs. They're pretty tasty. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.